Hey there, I'm Rob, and I am really grateful and excited to have these next minutes with you. And recently I was thinking about my first steps. And I remember just laying there on the ground, looking up at the ceiling, and then I just stood up. And I didn't really know why I was standing up. And I grabbed onto the coffee table that we had in our living room. And I remember looking around and surveying the room and thinking, I can do this. And I looked over at my mom, and she seemed to just intuitively know what I was thinking because she held her arms out. And I took that first step. And after that, I was like, let's do this. And I took another step, and I made it all the way to her, and she embraced me. And you know what I love best about that story? Is that I completely made it up, because nobody remembers their first steps, right? Like, that would be really, really weird. But you know what I do remember? I remember the first time I ever rode a bike. It was my brother's Schwinn, and it was red with what's called a banana seat. And I remember my dad and I had been working on it, and finally it was time for me to go, and he let go, and I went down that street. I remember getting my driver's license on my 16th birthday. My mom took me out of school, and we went to lunch, and then we got home, and she gave me the keys to her 1986 Volvo, and I went to a convenience store, so like a Quick Star. It was called White Hen Pantry. And I remember getting some snacks and just the freedom that I felt as I was blasting my music, driving down the street. I also remember the first time I scored a goal in hockey on my high school team. I wasn't a great player, and I wish I had the story about how I went around four guys and popped it into the corner of the net, but no, it was more of like I had the puck and guys were coming towards me, and so I just shot it, and it hit off a defenseman's stick and went over the goalie's shoulder, but it was still a pretty great moment. I'm going to guess that you remember a lot of steps you've taken in your life. You probably don't remember all of them, but there's some really significant steps that you'll never forget. And during our time here, we are going to talk about a step that if you take it, you will never, ever forget it, and your life will never be the same. And as a follower of Jesus, that's really what it's all about, is taking steps. We take that first step to cross the faith line and decide to follow Jesus, and then it's all about taking next steps to move forward. And so when I was a senior in high school, I was new to following Jesus. It's a decision that I made at the end of my junior year. And a man named Craig Taylor, he ran the youth ministry at the church I was at, invited me to go on a mission trip to Mexico. And I said yes and traveled to a little town called Reynosa. And Reynosa is just over the border of Texas. And we worked in this neighborhood there that actually in Mexico, they call it a colonia, right? It's like colony, except it's like a Spanish word. And you probably want to say that. So why don't you go ahead and repeat after me, colonia. Okay, that was pretty good, right? So colonia. So we worked in this colonia, and we spent the week building a house. Now, if you were going to build a house, I would not be somebody that you would reach out to. I had no idea what I was doing, but we made it work. And actually, you're going to see a picture, which is going to be the floor of the house. It was very uneven ground, but I'm pretty proud of what we did. We also spent the week teaching Vacation Bible School. And we faced some challenges, but boy, I'm so grateful that Craig Taylor asked me to go on that trip because it changed my lives. And hear this, life-altering things can happen when we accept an invitation. And so in the years since that trip, I've actually been on over 20 mission projects to so many different places. Many of them were to Mexico. I've met so many people. I've seen God do some great things, and I've seen lives transformed. I've also become fluent in Spanish, is what I'd like to say, but unfortunately, mi español es muy malo. You have to ask somebody to translate that for you, but isn't it great when we're invited into things? I personally would rather somebody invite me into something than somebody tell me to go and do something, right? Are you with me on that, right? It's better if somebody says, hey, let's go do this, than somebody saying, hey, you go do that. And you know who else really loved inviting people into things? Okay, I'm going to give you a little tip here. When somebody asks a question in church, it's usually safe to just answer Jesus, right? You're going to be right more often than you're not. It actually reminds me of this little story, and I'll just go ahead and tell this story. And so this person was teaching children in church, and she wanted to give an example of someone who worked really, really, really hard so they can get a reward afterwards. And so she started the lesson by saying to the kids, hey, I'm going to describe something. And when you know what it is, I want you to raise your hand and I want you to answer. And the kids were really excited and they leaned forward and they were listening. And so she's like, all right, let's do this. I'm thinking of something that lives in a tree and eats nuts. Looks around the room. Nobody raises their hand. She said, it could be gray or brown and have a long bushy tail. Still no hands are going up. And she goes, it chatters and sometimes it flips its tail if it gets excited. And the kid raises his hand and she's like, oh, good, somebody. And so Michael is his name. And she's like, Michael, why don't you tell me what it is? And he goes, well, it sure sounds like a squirrel, but I'm going to go ahead and say Jesus, right? I know, it just one of those stories. So hopefully people are amused by that. And so this story had nothing to do with the point, which is this. Hey, Jesus is really big on inviting people into things. And so at the end of his time on earth, after Jesus had died on the cross, he had risen from the grave, he had spent time with his disciples as a resurrected being. He had kind of these last words to say to them. And if you have a Bible, turn to the book of Matthew. Matthew's about 2/3 of the way through the Bible. You're going to go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and go to Matthew chapter 28. And so Matthew was a guy who hung out with Jesus, right? So he knew him. They were close, but I guess a good way to say it is like they would Snapchat all the time. And he wasn't on his best friends list, but he was on his recents. And it's somewhere in here that they definitely had streaks, right? And so they hung out together. And in Matthew chapter 28, starting with verse 18, let me read to you from the Bible. It says, then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of age. Hey, when you go to small groups, you're going to talk about these verses, but I want to just focus on the part where Jesus says, go and make disciples. I mentioned to you already that I prefer that people invite me into things rather than telling me to go to things. And so it's easy to look at these words and hear Jesus' command as, hey, go. You go and make disciples. I'm going. You go make disciples. Yeah, but there's really an invitation here, and we've been missing out. I'm going to show you another picture here, and then I'm going to give you a little context. There's a young man at the center of the picture that you just saw, and his name is Juan. We met Juan in Matamoros, Mexico in 1998. We went on a mission trip with a group from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so we invited a bunch of kids from the colonia we were working in to go play football. Most of you probably know that football is soccer. It's kind of weird, right? Because football is soccer like everywhere in the world except for the United States and maybe Canada. But I don't really know what they do in Canada. And who cares what they do in Canada? Okay, I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't make fun of Canadians. That's not cool. But anyway, also, have you ever thought it's really weird that we would say Peyton Manning is one of the greatest football players of all time, but yet the ball never really touched his foot? Okay, I'll stop now, but sometimes these are the things I think about. Anybody else just have random weird thoughts like that? Yeah, you probably shouldn't share them if you're ever recording a video. But here's the point. We were playing football with these kids, and after we were done, we asked them to come together, and a couple of our students shared their faith story. They told them how Jesus had changed their lives. And there's this thing people do on mission trips. And it's kind of weird and predictable, but at the end of the message, they'll say, now raise your hand if you want to follow Jesus. And these kids they understood most of what you said, and they just raised their hand because they like you. And so let's say 50 kids raised their hand. And then by the end of the summer, the mission organization would be like, we had 500 kids come to know Jesus, but really 50 kids raised their hand 10 times. But Juan was different. You see, because when we finished and we started walking away, he just sat there. And so a guy in our group named Jason went and sat down with him. Jason was a senior guy. And I heard the beginning of their conversation. Jason didn't really know a lot of Spanish, so he said, ¿Cómo te llamas? What's your name? It's like, Juan. ¿Cuántos años tienes? How old are you? 12. And so I'm thinking, he's a little older than those kids. It's probably why he sat in the back. And I also noticed something about Juan. He had this hat on that I couldn't make what was on it, so I looked over, and it was a marijuana leaf. So I was like, he was kind of too cool for school. And so then Jason's running out of things to say, and he's like, ¿Te gusta fútbol? You like soccer? He's like, sí. So I kind of tapped on Alex. Real name is Alejandro. He was our translator. And I said, hey, go help him out. And I kind of walked away, didn't know really what the conversation was, and watched as they chatted for a while. And then Jason took something out of his backpack and he gave it to Juan. And then it was time for us to go. So the group was heading back to church. And me and two of my leaders decided, hey, let's do a quick lap around the field, make sure nobody left anything behind, and let's just plan the rest of the day. And so we were standing there and we realized after a while we were talking for a good 15 minutes. And then when I turned around and I looked over, Juan was sitting there on a pile of garbage. And that's the picture, and we'll show it to you again. Now, I'm serious, this is like a pile of garbage. Like, it smelled like the bus ride home from a middle school boys trip. Like, it was bad. And he had been sitting there the entire time reading the Bible that Jason gave him. And in the picture, he has two friends that are leaning in, and he's just focused and locked in. And here's the point. He was invited to play football. He was invited to hear some students share. And he was invited to know Jesus, and he was invited to read the Bible. Life-altering things can happen when we'll just accept an invitation. And so back to Jesus. Jesus is inviting his disciples to go. Go and make disciples of all nations. We'll go where? We'll go anywhere. Go anywhere where people need to know about Jesus. But go and do what? Go and make disciples of all nations. And so why is he saying that? He's saying it because he wants us to look beyond where we are right now. He wants us to recognize that Jesus isn't just working here, but he is working all around this world. He is working in Kenya. He is working in Haiti. He is working in Guatemala. He is working in the Federated States of Micronesia. Yes, that's a country. Did you know that? But God is God everywhere, right? He loves the Vietnamese. He loves the French, the Peruvians, the Dominicans. And he says, go and make disciples anywhere of all nations. And so when Jesus says go, the invitation isn't, hey, you go and have fun. You go do that. The invitation is, hey, let's go. Come with me because I'm already there and I want you to come and be a part of what I'm already doing around the world. Go and make disciples is let's go make disciples together. He is inviting you to make disciples of all nations. And really the only question for you to still answer is, will you accept his invitation to go? You see, even though we like to be invited to things, there are many times we don't accept an invitation. And sometimes it's wise, like if someone's like, hey, you want to go murder somebody? You're probably going to be like, nah, bro, I'm good, right? But often our reasons for not doing good things are selfish. Not always, but often. I mean, sometimes it's a priority thing. It's not always bad. If you asked me to go hang out at Buffalo Wild Wings at 10 p.m., I'm probably going to be like, no, I'm going to go to bed, right? But that's because I'm an old man. You probably feel a little bit differently. But see, every day, Jesus invites you and I to spend time with him. Matthew 6:33 says to seek first his kingdom and righteousness. So we have that invitation, but how often do we choose something else? Like probably all the time, right? Sleep, food, friends, Netflix, whatever. It's priorities. Sometimes we decline an invitation out of fear. I know I do. You see, I have this real fear of going into situations that are unknown. As an adult, I went on a trip to Guatemala to serve in an orphanage. And I was scared the entire time up until that first night laying down in the bed in this orphanage in Guatemala. I was constantly thinking, I want to get out of this trip. I don't want to be here. I don't want to go. You ever felt that way? We're just so scared of the unknown. And sometimes that fear can be paralyzing. Sometimes we fear being alone. What's the first thing people say when you invite them to go on a trip? Well, who else is going? Well, let me tell you something about when it comes to these mission opportunities, the opportunities to go. Hey, Jesus is going. Like he's already there. Yeah, but I don't want to go if my best friend doesn't go. I don't want to. Really? Think about what you could miss out on. Maybe sometimes you fear that, hey, I can't do the thing that they're calling me to go do. To that, I would just say, I built a house. And my wife won't even let me hang things like on the wall in our house. I've mixed concrete in different countries probably a dozen times. And to this day, I still don't know how to mix concrete. But we did it. We worked together. You see, because I want you to hear this. When we won't alter our priorities, when we won't let God turn our fear into faith, we miss out on the life-altering invitations that Jesus is extending to us. And so at Prairie Lakes Church, we provide so many global opportunities. And you know why we do that? Because we want to invite you to grab a hold of what Jesus is doing and his invitation to go. Because for many of you, this is your next step. And it is a step that if you take, you will never, ever forget. And you will never, ever be the same. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, but those things cost a lot of money. Yeah, they really do, right? And that's hard. But that sounds like priorities talking. And that sounds like fear. Hear this, God's got this. Will you trust him? Will you take that step out? I believe that God is going to provide if you will step out and trust him. Oh, maybe you're like, oh, I'm really busy. I've got basket weaving camp and I can't possibly. That's cool, kind of. But that's why there's so many opportunities to go. There are so many opportunities all year for you to go. And if God's inviting you, he's going to find a way. Because life-altering things can happen when we accept God's invitations. And so my prayer for you is that we would grab a hold of his invitation and be people that grab a hold of it and are willing to step out and go. Let me just pray for you. And so, God, I pray that we would be people who would go, who would transform our fear into faith and trust you and know that we'll never be the same.